Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to this month's NATINA korero with Sarah Vaughan and Vanessa White. I'll get us going with our karakia. Karakia te matanga. Mana kitea tēnei hui, mana kitea tēnei rupu, mana kitea tēnei whānau. Tai noa ki tainei kaupapa. Arahina nā korero, arahina nā patai. Arahina nā ture nei, kia puta ai te maramatanga. So bless this meeting, bless this group, bless this family as we come together for this gathering. Guide the conversations, guide the questions, guide the intent so that we move on to greater understanding. Today is a really special day. We've got three moms sitting here and having this korero. I'll quickly just introduce myself. So I am parent to three fabulous boys. They all have a range of learning needs and disabilities, and they are the ones who teach me each and every day to connect with them in different ways to learn and grow myself and stretch myself every day. So I'm also the founder and chairperson for NATINA, and our intent is to really support the conversations that allow for neuroscience and trauma-informed approaches in the educational spaces, in the communities, with professionals, with community members, families, to understand our children better, to support them better, and ensure they have the sense of inclusion, belonging, which is so essential and crucial for their well-being. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two fabulous wahine today, Sarah Vaughan and Vanessa White. Now, Sarah is a parent of a neurodivergent child, and they've been through their journey in the education system with a lot of challenges that have led to trauma. And the journey of healing from that trauma has I guess forced, I would say, Sarah, isn't it, you to get out of that educational space and environment and really allow for that recovery, repair to happen. So
still a work in progress, but yeah.
yes, absolutely. And it takes time, doesn't it? It doesn't happen.
It does.
So it's really, really important. And Vanessa, you've been on your own journey as well, with your children in the education space. And you also work in the professional education space. So that's really interesting because you are a mother who is, going through all these challenges. And you are also in the initial teacher education space, which means you have some ability to influence some of those changes and make sure, initial teacher education shifts so that trauma is prevented in the education spaces. So we're going to have a really rich korero today, but I would like to pass it on to you, first of all, Sarah, if you want to just introduce yourself a bit, and then Vanessa can introduce herself, talk a bit more about yourselves, and then we'll get the conversation going.
Thank you, Fran. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Vaughan. I live in Kapiti. I'm the mum of a neurodiverse child. Our family is neurodivergent neurodiverse. We, I guess, started off in the education system like everybody else, went through a couple of primary schools, sort of found we weren't getting the support we needed, and weren't able to have the conversations in a constructive way with the school. So made the call to shift across to correspondence school, and we've been in that space now for, I think, about five years. Sort of occasionally looked at going back into mainstream environment, but for various reasons it just wasn't going to be something that worked for our family's well-being.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. Vanessa, what about you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Kia ora. I would like to introduce myself to start with in my ancestral language of Scott Gaelic, if I might. So, hello, is Misha Vanessa White, is Misha Nishin Jenny, Joan, Mary Agnes, and Flora. Sigil, e Pākehā, a whanam, rag, e thoga me an rangwahia, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So what that means is that my name is Vanessa White. I came from a line from my mum, Jenny, her mum, Joan, and her mother, Mary Agnes, and her mother, Flora. And that I'm Scott Gale and Pākehā, and that I grew up in Rangiwahia in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi mahana noi kia koutou katoa. Ko te whenua tupu rangitikei no Rangiwahia au. Nō reira, ko ruahine, te maunga eru nei taku ngākau. Ko oroa, te awa e mahia nei aku māharahara no kirikiri roa ahau. E mihi anan ki ngā tohu o nihi, o waikato o nihi nei au. Ko Calvin Hainsworth, tōku mātua. Ko Jennifer Hainsworth, tōku whaia. Ko Sean Hainsworth, taku tūngani. And because we've got a kapiti link in here, I'm going to go a little bit further than that because we have a kapiti link further in our lineage. I te taha o tōku whaia, ko Joan Laws tōku kuia, ko Bill Laws tōku karawa. I te taha o tōku mātua, ko Mary Baker tōku kuia, ko George Hainsworth tōku karawa. Ko Kevin White taku tāne, ko Rose taku tāmahine, ko Jacob taku tāne, and ko Vanessa White tōku ingoa. And I won't do a waiata, but I want to I'll round it up with a whakatauki, which is Clonan and Gale and Geolab Halia, which means shoulder to shoulder. We cross these deep waters together, and I think that encapsulates our mahi here tonight as we come together. I'd like to mihi please to Freyan for being here and for leading this, and for everyone in the background involved, and NATINA, and also to everybody who is here tonight, because everyone who is drawn in here tonight is here for a reason. I've got lots of awesome people who are coming in to support, and I appreciate you all. Thank you. And yeah, so I hope that this is a really rich korero and that everyone gets to take something away which supports their growth and empowers their journey. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome.
Thank you. Kia ora, Vanessa. That was absolutely beautiful. It was really, really lovely that you could do the mihi in a way that was culturally appropriate to you and use your Gaelic language. Really, really do appreciate you taking the time sharing that with us. I do want to say today's korero is really special because it brings a lot of our personal journey, a lot of our personal experiences. And so I do want to just reach out to our audience today, our attendees, anybody else listening later on to, the conversations, the recording as well. This is really deep hard work for us as parents who are supporting our children, and we come with the greatest hopes and the best of intentions to work alongside other people so that our children have safe spaces to learn in, to grow in, and to thrive. So this is really, really important, Mahi. So please be mindful and respectful of the korero today. And yeah, that's one thing I want to start off with. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges first of all. What have been the challenges in the education space? And at what point did you realize that this is actually causing trauma? Did you even acknowledge or realize the term trauma? I know for me, I went through a lot of my journey, just saying this is the discrimination we experience, this is how it is. And, as a parent, I've got to stand up for my child, keep fighting. And I always thought I was a great advocate for my children, not realizing I was operating for many, many years in that fight state of the nervous system. That's where I was operating for many years. So and the bit about trauma only clicked in my head when I sort of entered that freeze zone, started dissociating and really not being able to cope. What was it for you, Vanessa? How did when did you realize what was happening, what was going on? At what point did you think, oh my goodness, this is actually trauma that we are experiencing? It's not just, little incidents of discrimination as such.
I had a long journey. It took me a long time to get there. I didn't really perceive it as discrimination. I recognized it as a lack of understanding, a lack of lived experience that it often takes to really be able to recognize and understand what's going on for our young people and their families as a whole, because these kids aren't doing this journey on their own. It's absolutely everybody in the boat.
Yes.
So we'd already been in the school system for quite some time. Our first struggle started in early childhood with our eldest. And I just want to add in here that I have spoken to all the people who I referenced tonight, my own 2 biological children, my young, beautiful whāngai daughter, and others. They've given permission to share. So I'm just going to be a bit generic in how I share it. But the permissions are there because I recognise that these stories, when they go out, then they stay out there, and it's not us that has to live with them, it's our young people too. So with our schooling and early childhood, we had a really big mismatch because we had an avid self-taught reader who was already reading in his bedroom at 2. We caught him reading because he's sitting there going, Thomas the Tank Engine. I think it was 18 months. And we were like, yeah, okay, whatever. So our big journey to start with was to understand and get a grip on what it was to be neurodivergent in the space of what is termed giftedness, a term that doesn't sit well with many people because it's seen as exclusionary. But once you dig into it and you really get a handle on it, you can appreciate that really it's just it's an unfortunate term to mean that you have kids who make those connections very rapidly in the areas of interest, in the areas of learning, and also means that those connections are being made rapidly in terms of their emotional and spiritual growth too. But you have big lags often in that twice exceptionality and other areas which are very challenging. So we had a huge mismatch at preschool with someone who wanted to read, who was being told by the teachers, you don't need to read till you're at school, telling us that we were pushing things, which we just so weren't. He could have moved into the library. He would have been the happiest kid in the world. And then obviously by the time we got to school, to primary school, he had gone into himself at that point, and was refusing to read anywhere around anybody. Had already lost total confidence, didn't want to show it, had an amazing teacher for the transition. But after that one magic teacher, things sort of went downhill because we just didn't have the understanding. And I can totally understand that. And that's when I started my road into the professional side of things. So to cut it short, because I would talk to Evis forever, sorry guys. Second lot of schooling, totally different experience, but similar outcomes. Yeah. It wasn't really until our family self-destructed with the stress, because we had one child who went in and got depressed and self-harm itself, into the, trigger warning, suicidal space at the age of 7. And then our next experience was a child who exploded outwards. And of course, one is socially acceptable amongst children and seen as a whatever, it'll pass, and the other one is not. It's seen as socially unacceptable. And so we went through all the processes of discipline and exclusion, and it was extraordinarily stressful. And I ended up with post-traumatic stress. Then I had to learn about it. Then I could see it, what was happening with my young people. Then I could address it in myself and support my young people.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was so long.
No. Look, it reminds me how, as parents, we have to be kind to ourselves as well, because we are also on a learning journey. And I think, when I first started my journey, I used to be very, very upset and annoyed that people don't understand, educators don't understand our children well enough. When I went through the journey of not understanding, trauma, and learning to understand trauma, learning to understand the nervous system, regulation of the nervous system, and moving away from behavioral sort of, approaches, I realized I was also on a learning journey. And so I've learned actually to be a lot kinder to other people when they don't know, and sort of, walk through that journey with them, support that journey, encourage that journey, rather than sort of, get adversarial or demanding in terms of, well, how can you not? So I think that's been a big shift. And yeah, so look, I'm sorry you've had such deeply distressing, experiences, and eventually sort of getting to that space of knowing where and how to go about it. Vanessa, can I quickly ask a follow-up question? How did you start your journey in terms of learning, understanding about trauma? What helped you get along that way? What supported you? Who supported you? What was that like?
So for us, it was that pre-exclusion stage where we're looking for anything and everything we can use in terms of strategies to support our young person, not understanding why when we're putting things in place, they're not being picked up, or they're not being sustainable. It's just not manageable for our young person. We were introduced to the Fun Friends program. And for me,
sorry, which
that
program?
taught the Fun Friends program. So it teaches kids about emotions and anxiety specifically, and social connectedness and social skills. So for me, it actually taught me what I needed to know, even though I didn't tend. But that upshot of it was that I learned what I needed to kickstart what I needed to for our child. Our child was being taught cognitively based skills he was not ready for. We had to start with the bottom up sensory input, movement, talking to the body, rebalancing within the body, connectedness in other ways, instead of going straight up to the thinking brain and expecting our kids to stay in the thinking brain when they go into that triggered state. I didn't understand any of that, but it gave me enough of a question and a curiosity to explore, and that took me into understanding trauma and trauma-informed practices. And I was very fortunate because I got to go over to the US to present at the inaugural Trauma-Informed Educators Conference over there. And so that developed my understanding another whole layer. And I really got to understand its US whakapapa and how it came about. The trauma-informed practices come through from the Vietnam War experiences, and that's where our understandings derive from, and left me with that huge big question of how are we addressing this massive gap in what we're talking about and what's coming in these new practices into Aotearoa from overseas in terms of cultural appropriateness. And the reality is that knowledge is in communities, it's place-based, it's embedded already there, it's in the whakapapa, but it wasn't being woven in. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think I went a bit off track.
No, it does. Absolutely does. Absolutely does. Because, I remember when you went to that conference, you were all excited about it. I was excited. I was like, oh, something's happening. And I remember when we first started these conversations, like I think about over 3 years ago, I was just excited to meet one other person and one other person. And I am amazed how many one other person I've met, and I still keep meeting and coming across. So for me, this is so crucial. I'm like, why are people working as individuals? Why don't we have, that collective support networking happening? And so my hope is, NATINA is that space, allows for that network. And I do want to acknowledge, Vanessa, I know even before we formally sort of established NATINA, you've sort of set up the Facebook group, the trauma-informed, Aotearoa group on Facebook, which allows these conversations to happen, people to connect as well, right? And then now we've got the educators group as well. So that's been really useful. So thank you for that. And thank you for getting these conversations going, so that more people can become aware of the risks that our children face, in the education space around their well-being, their safety, and what can be done to sort of, prevent those challenges in the trauma and the education space. So thank you for sharing that. Sarah, do you want to share a little about your journey and your experiences? Tell us about what the challenges were for you and where and how again, did they finally sort of lead you to that understanding of this is actually trauma? I know different parents have talked about it in very different ways in terms of, parents of disabled, neurodivergent children have spoken about this in lots of different ways. What was it for you? And when did it sort of click for you in terms of we've got to start doing things differently? Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
So I think, we were really fortunate. We had a really good journey through early childhood education system. And as soon as we hit school, it's okay, this ain't working. And, it was, we didn't have the language and the frameworks at the time, but we were seeing there's a change, there's something going on here, there's reactive behavior. Much later on, when you start the doing more and more reading in depth and exposure to some of the networks, this trauma framework, this is really familiar. It describes what I've been through. But I think we were really lucky very early on that there was a couple of things that were just said to us. I don't know, I always say we were really lucky, little points in life that you're grateful for, and you look back and go, that was a really good turning point. We talking to our doctor, discussing what was going on. This sounds like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's okay, right? And so it changes how you look at things and the experiences. We'd been very much looking at, when we were in the midst of it, it was very much about rights from our perspective. Our child has a right to education. Why are you not meeting it? And weren't really engaging at the time with the trauma side of it, but actually that's very much what it was, and particularly when you look at the impacts. I think on our journey we got pointed very early on to some resources from a psychologist, literally just a couple of photocopied pages, and it was about some of Ross Green's work around if you're going to put the child in a situation that they're going to struggle to cope with, just don't. It essentially was what we read into it. It's like, that makes sense. So that really informed how we started to approach things as we went through the education system, and kind of gave us the courage to draw lines and set boundaries. And that sort of is what led us to exiting the mainstream education system, and that it was like, actually, this isn't working, and these are the changes we need, and it's non-negotiable. So if it's not going to work in mainstream, we need another option. And that was quite an involved conversation with the ministry, but we got there in the end, and that's how we got into Dakota. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Very interesting how you said, you started looking at those reactive behaviors, being told this sounds like PTSD. For me, it was different. I started thinking about, I think I've got anxiety because my heart races. Every time I drive down the school, I get tearful or I get butterflies in my tummy. Every time I used to walk into the school, I would get tense, like physically really tense. It was felt like I was going into combat, and I would be going into assembly or to simply drop off something. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And so I kept wondering whether I was experiencing anxiety. And then I started looking at, is this depression? And for me, that's where, the understanding of sort of trauma came about. And very interesting, Sarah. You said you had to leave that space. And obviously, if you are in a space that causes trauma, you cannot heal. So you really do need to shift, isn't it? And I think as a parent, I must admit, when I first started my journey, I was all about my children's rights. And so I was very focused on their rights. And I thought I have to fight and uphold their rights no matter what. Until I started realizing what was happening, in terms of that trauma, the nervous system. And our son also had really sort of, those explosive behaviors. And he had never had those, but he wasn't happy in that space. He knew he didn't belong. He wasn't supported. And I kept thinking if I can enforce his rights, things will be okay. But they wouldn't, because he was experiencing trauma
Yeah.
day in and
Yeah.
day out. And so, it was important for him to exit as well. We exited the mainstream and went into special education, despite always, valuing inclusive education so much. So, yeah, I totally understand.
And one of the things, the boundaries, it moved from, the boundaries for the child to the boundaries for the family. And a lot of that now for us is, we are in a position where it's different to dealing with a mainstream school. We can choose how and when we engage. And often I'm very deliberate about making sure that I'm in a good space. If I'm in a bad space, it ain't gonna go well. So just, being really, having that ability to choose when and how to engage has been massive in terms of the journey to being in a better place. Yeah.
That's fabulous. I like that, setting boundaries and having choice and control, because choice and control is one of those fundamental, empowerment and choice is one of the principles of trauma-informed practice. You don't give choice and control to your children, or you don't have it as a family, then it is going to impact negatively. Absolutely hear you. Yes. You've mentioned Ross Green's work, and I know you've attended the workshop.
My husband did. My husband did.
Yes.
I missed out.
Yeah. So that's been really interesting, isn't it? The whole concept of kids do well if they can, and there's we need to collaborate, and I like that framework of his, because again it's the collaborative problem solving, and the collaboration is again another key principle of trauma-informed approaches. And so if you provide the students with that choice, control, autonomy, and really, really hear their voice and sort of, consider it and make sure it's part of that learning program, then they are bound to be more engaged, and you are going to see less of those explosive behaviors.
Yeah.
How? Go ahead.
One thing I really like about the model is it really encourages you to understand that the child is a person and that they actually can, well, for us, Jamie can express how he's feeling. So it helps us just really have a model for a conversation to find out what is actually going on, and therefore, what do you do about it?
Yeah. Oh, love that. Love that. That is so interesting. Vanessa, tell us a little bit about where and how were you able to finally allow for that choice and control, your children's voice to come through and be heard. How did you manage that? What made the shift?
So it's really interesting. We had a very long healing journey. So I'm going to frame this around one particular person, because that's really where the bulk of our journey has sat in terms of understanding and making changes and healing forward as a family. So we, with a lot of tussling, ended up in Te Kura. We found that we still had a mismatch because we had such a high level of resistance to anything that was associated with schooling. So learning, cool. Learning, happy to learn, but nothing that triggered an association with schooling. So we spent a lot of time just focused on fun and bonding, connection. We withdrew out of Te Kura because we really couldn't make progress. Even though we had huge open opportunities, he just wasn't ready to engage in what was required of him within a system, even one that was really, really loosely structured, and with the best of teachers. So we have now in an unschooling environment. We have my mum, who's been an educator all her life, who brings a wealth of understanding and knowledge. And we live in a papagoing sort of village situation here with 3 generations, and my parents and my husband's parents and other family here. And it was really hard to juggle that, because I loved school. I did well at school until I ran off the rails as a teenager and left school and then went back. So school, it was always, I never really wanted to leave school, as per se. I loved school. I loved education. I loved learning. It was instilled with me from tiny. It was really hard for me to understand that that wasn't always the way forward. And I had to learn to sit comfortably within an unschooling space for my child. And it's taken a long time for me to find that inner peace. And throughout that, he knows himself. He knows what he loves to do. It might not be socially acceptable to have hours of gaming, but actually he's flourishing. He learns all sorts of things. He's got this massive array of life skills. He's got this wonderful group of solid friends that he has built through his interests, and he's just blooming. And if I kept going on trying to put things in front of him as options and put pressure on, I just think we would have sat in this cycle of it would have disconnected us, and in disconnecting us, then we take away those opportunities for healing and growth. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no. What you mentioned to me just highlights what systemic trauma is. The fact that he refused to even engage with anything linked to the systems, the schooling systems, it shows what a huge impact those processes within a system can have on individuals. I think I hear it over and over again in the disability space, how systems disable people, both from disabled adults and, family members. And the way often parents will say things like, oh my goodness, I have to now fill up this form again, or I have to say my story, again, for the nth time. We have to put up a case and, justify every little bit. All these bits, the processes you're put through again and again, through the systems, can be so harmful. And it is so important that, these conversations about trauma-informed approaches not only happen in the health and education and the social services space, but also in the wider system space, the wider sectors, because the sectors where people interact, we engage, we, access support services of all sorts of types, can actually really harm us, and especially, the marginalized groups of people. So now, thank you for sharing that. What has helped you, Vanessa, personally in your learning and growth? Where and how, where did your understanding, knowledge of trauma come from? And what has that journey been like for you?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to step back before I go into that and just mention about systemic trauma?
Yes, absolutely.
The reason I say that is because I've got a couple of stories that I think will highlight that.
Yeah.
So for me, systemic trauma is all about, it's the culture of a system, and it's the pressures put on it from policy and government, but it's also the pressures within from expectations and interpretations of those policies and how they are managed. And that comes with leadership and teams, and filters down through other teams and staff within the school. So for me, I believe from my work with educators and with whānau that to break that cycle is to go in there and actually help everyone heal together. So when we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about what that means, that it's not just about, being in a war zone, having a major accident. It's not just those sudden acute or or those massive, big politically driven experiences, that actually it can be an accumulation of constant stress, which has a real bearing on how we function or don't function in the world. So for us, we enrolled at a school knowing we were going in with a stressed kid. We tried to be proactive. I'd learned from first time around the schooling system, I thought. So I felt like we'd gone in sort of, I'd armed with some knowledge, and I knew what sort of things to ask and how to come alongside. But by the time I started learning about neurodivergence, instead of being seen as someone who could bring understanding into a school community, I was seen as someone who might be a threat, because now I was coming in as a parent with knowledge that wasn't welcomed. It wasn't an invitational space for that, and when things came unstuck, we ended up often in a bit of a blame game. So we were only in our first school for a week because it was the last week of the year. Everything turned to custard very quickly, and we ended up with a child under the principal's desk, and the principal was as angry as the child starting school, which wasn't really a good start. And so we didn't go back there. We tried to enroll in another school, and they said, we will trial your child because now he has a story behind him, and we don't think that this is going to probably work for our school, so we'll trial him. And I went, well, I'm not going there. He's had 1 week of school and you're going to trial him. So we actually ended up in zone, and the reason we hadn't gone in zone to start with was because we were working with food allergies, and we already knew there was no understanding of that, and there wasn't a lot of openness around those conversations, and the food allergy was significant, and that added to the anxiety, along with the fact that he was a maths kid, and he was he got frustrated at kindy because his buddies, his 3-year-olds, didn't want to play this game with 3-digit numbers, So I'm never going to be a teacher, Mummy came in and said, because no one wants to learn anything. But he had one teacher in those early years of preschool which got him through. And that's a key thing that keeps coming up and again for us, is having that understanding person, even if it's not the one in the classroom, it's having that understanding adult somewhere at school where your young person can go and connect, and go freely without having to get permission and being blocked. So in our coming into that third school, I'm sorry this is a bit long-winded, but the first thing we hit when I went in there and explained the situation was, it's going to be fine, I can't wait to tell you I told you so. That was what we got from the principal. And of course it wasn't fine, and it all turned to rubbish. And I had a wee giggle in our exclusion meeting, because now I have this mouse story to tell, because we were in there, everyone was really, really anxious and nervous. Everyone was wound up, and a mouse ran through the room, and the DP, who was the one in there as the leadership team, leapt on her chair and did the whole classic cartoon, there's a mouse, I'm not stepping on the floor, there's a mouse, get it out. And I watched her go, now with the knowledge that she'd gone into that trauma stress state of being triggered, and here she was, and I knew what was coming. They were about to exclude my child because he had torn a page out of someone's book, he'd not hurt anybody, had not actually wrecked anything. They said, but what if he does? What if he damages something like an iPad or something? That was their reasoning. And so I watched on with amusement as I witnessed it occurring, recognizing that it was just a gap and lack of understanding, and she was where I was not that long ago when I was getting upset when my kid got upset, instead of me keeping my cool, so for me. But in terms of impacts, we went back to vote about, I don't know how many months after the exclusion, maybe 6 months, could have been a year, I don't know. I shook for 2 hours after going into that school hall.
Wow.
Because I was in such a stress state just from having to enter that space where we'd gone through all of that. So the impacts are massive, and so the healing process takes a long time. So I've answered one question, I don't know what the other one was, but please, Sarah, jump in. Sorry.
No, look, this is really, really interesting. Go for it, Sarah.
Yeah, just so much of what you say resonates, the bit about being a threat. You know, and you see your child struggling, so you reach out, you talk to people, you do the reading, you work out what's going on. But then, you know, you're seen as somebody who's trying to teach teachers how to do their job, and it's like, well, actually, no, I've worked out what's going on for my child. This is what they need. We know better. Don't tell us how to do our job, type thing. Yeah, but it's not working. You know, that really resonates, and just that. You know, I went through a phase, just struggling in general, and I had to walk past the school. You know, to get to work where I live, I have to go past the school, the first school. You know, if I'm going to the dairy, I have to go past the school. And it's just every time you go past, you're like, that sucked. You know, so that experience, 9 years, and you're still sitting there with daily reminders. And you know, everybody else that was involved, they've moved on. But you know, it's still there, the impact of that, the social impacts in terms of the community connections, the financial impacts for us. We had to go down, you know, pretty much as soon as my child started school, we had to go down to being a one-income family. It's a massive financial impact, you know, and that's an impact that's lasted 10 years. You add up those numbers, you know, they're not small financial impact numbers. We've been really fortunate that we've been able to, you know, had the family resilience to cope with that. You know, another little good thing that you look back on and you say you're grateful for. But you know, you're just always carrying that. I think, you know, you talked about, just jumping back to the system disables, that was something that we really recognized very early on, because we had dyslexia in the mix, and that needed, you know, child needed to be taught explicitly how to read and write. And if he didn't get that in the early years, he would not be able to engage in education in the later years. You know, the lack of literacy skills, once you're beyond about year 4, become an absolute barrier to participating in education. So we ended up making the choice to deal with that ourselves. You know, the upside of that, we met some really amazing people, got some support from some people that were on similar journeys to us, and, you know, learned a lot from other people. Yeah, so there's always impacts. They don't go away, but you look for the good in it as well. I think, you know, some of the people we've interacted with have just been amazing on this journey, and we wouldn't have interacted with them through normal mainstream school. And I've learned so much, and I think I'm a better person as a result of it. So yeah, sorry, sounds like I'm writing a gratitude journal, but that's what you do to center and kind of go,
yes,
yeah, you know, you don't want to lose yourself in all the bad and the pain.
no.
You want to say, hey, there's some stuff.
Look, Sarah, thanks for sharing that. It is so important, because I think as parents, you know, when you feel like everything is lost, you hold on to anything, any tiny little bit, isn't it? So that you don't lose your hope. And you know, for me, I think when people say things, because I've done a lot of things in the advocacy space, okay? And I've been very, very proactive, and I will push myself to, you know, get things done and going. And what I've started realizing now is that is my trauma response. That is me trying to cope, not lose hope. And that is me trying to recover and repair in a dysfunctional way, to be very honest, because, you know, that's been my way of coping. But one of the things I'm starting to shift in my thinking is with the healing, the journey of healing, the journey of recovery and repair, that connection with those other people is so critical and so important.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that helps, you know, you keep going. I remember when I sort of first started doing the advocacy stuff for in the education space around, you know, our children's rights to inclusion. I would be constantly at it, even holidays like December and stuff. That would be my letter writing. Like I've got to write letters to the minister and this one and that one and submissions. And I was always preparing. And I remember when I became a part of the VIPS Equity in Education Facebook group and the admin team. I remember one of the years I said to myself, actually, I'm going to take a holiday this year. I'm not going to do any advocacy. And I almost felt both guilty and also felt like a rebel. Like, I'm not doing something that I have been doing for so long. But I needed it. And what gave me that opportunity to rest and stop was knowing that there were other people, other families, other parents in similar situations, and that they were advocating as well. And also not just families, there were so many educators that I came across, who are absolutely fantastic in terms of making inclusion happen. And that's why I know inclusion can happen, despite all the systemic barriers, because there are people who can make it happen. So, being connected to those people has been really important. And again, as I've gone on to this journey of, understanding more about the neuroscience trauma-informed approaches, just learning so much from each other is so important, isn't it? So that space of connecting with others is absolutely crucial and important. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. What would your message be to educators, to people who work with your children, or even people out in the community? What would your message be, to them in terms of how do you include, how do you create, the space for our children to belong? And how can, they better understand sometimes those quirky behaviors that our children have, or the different ways of communicating that they have, what has worked for you in that space? What would you like, to change and shift in that space? Tell me a bit about that.
I don't know if I know what's worked in that space. I know what's worked for our family, and that's been really careful about setting boundaries. But
talk about that.
Just something I was thinking. I've never felt welcome in the education system. I've never felt my family has been welcome in the education system. And Vanessa, listening to you talking about all the different options, one thing I want people to know: there's not a better place for us. There's not a magical school that exists in the next suburb over or the next city that is better for our kids and for our families. It doesn't exist. You're it, right? And if you think there's a better place, you're fooling yourself, right? And it might be easier to say, please go somewhere else, but for the family, it's not. And what we actually need is our local schools being inclusive and being welcoming. Because if you're not welcome, if you're not included, particularly in your smaller, tight-knit communities, it has absolutely massive impacts on the family and the connections in the community. It goes beyond the school community to social connections and their ability to be part of that wider community. So it's so fundamentally important to social inclusion and community well-being that schools are actually welcoming and inclusive. You're it.
Yeah. Thank you. Vanessa, did you want to share?
My head's sort of jumping all around the space as you're talking. So belonging is key. Connection is everything. So the first point I want to talk to is connection, the notion that when we're talking about understanding trauma as an embodied experience, as impacting us at every level, our tinana, our wairoa, hinangaro, it's every level. And if you're talking about the tinana, we're talking about genetic, we're talking about cellular, we're talking about DNA, right through everything, armoring up muscles, how we position our body, how we move through space. that it's about connection in our own selves. We have a level of connecting within our own self, within our own bodies. We have a connection with our cultural and spiritual sides that we can start to connect out to, a connection out to our closest people and network, our connection out to community, and then our connection out further that to our environment. And as Sonia McFarlane, who's my beautiful tuakana and friend, she says, it's that nested approach. We can't address this on a single level and go, this is about the child and we need to do this for the child. Well, we're certainly not fixing anyone. We are responding through aroha and making a nurturing, nourishing, safe space, because everything else comes second. Everything else comes after that. It follows on, it flows on. And I think we get really hung up, especially in the education system, with their requirements, because we have to tick the boxes for the ministry. So it makes it a bit of a juggle, but it is doable. And there's so many schools out there who are leading the way. And I want to shout out to Ngātea Primary School, because they're amazing in what they're doing, and they role model some beautiful ways forward. And there are many other schools out there doing it too, but we just don't hear about them. So it's out there. It's a matter of following what works. And just like with our young people, it's looking for and acknowledging strengths and what's going well. What we focus on is what we get more of. It's not just for behavior, it's for everything. So focus on the strengths, celebrate the strengths. Things will flow from that. And it's the same with our teachers and our schools. What are the strengths? How are we taking that forward? What's within our community? What's already there? What's place-based? Work with our communities. Bring in the knowledge that's already there. Our mana whenua have this rich korero and a huge understanding already, natural way of using that mana-enhancing, strengths-based approach. It aligns so beautifully. And the stories are there, the stories are in the land, the stories are in place, and it all weaves in to grow this amazing, strong, nurturing community for our young people. And I think the other thing is that we need to remember that we're not just working with our leadership team or our educators, that we also need to bring in our Board of Trustees members. They're our community members. They're key, pivotal members who help, lead the school forward. So bring them into that understanding. And bring in all the team, everyone in the school. I mean, if you are in a small community and you know the bus driver and the bus driver knows all the kids, bring them in so that everyone is developing the shared understanding and the shared approach, so that we're all working on the same page, and the whole community as a whole. So yeah, it enables and helps to break down some of those barriers for collaboration, because the actual practice of collaboration often needs some scaffolding, and especially when we need to be extra aware that, Sarah, you and I have been particularly lucky because we're in a household situation where we have got two adults in a relationship, and you can have one who is an income earner and the other not. As soon as you're not in that situation, you have to have two adults earning, or you only have one adult in the house, or you have people who just don't have that capacity because they've got other things going on in their lives. That creates this huge inequity in terms of their choices. We have few choices. There are others out there with far fewer choices. And unfortunately, what we see other systems coming in and doing power over, and things escalate out of control. So, that's when we start to see oranga tamariki coming in. That's when we start to see all those other layers of social services or health or police or whomever coming in, and rather than coming together, we see it smash apart. So we also need to bring them all in together in these conversations.
Absolutely. Gosh, Vanessa, you've shared so much, and as you're sharing, I was thinking that bit about two things: the connection, the importance of connection, and the nested approach, that ecological approach. I just want to highlight that applies to us as parents as well. I think it's so easy for us to let go of ourselves and to become so focused on our kids and supporting our kids that we forget that we need those supports too. We need, to be nested and to be supported and to be wrapped with with others who can sort of come along on our journey, who can, be there for us when we need co-regulation. We give it to our kids all the time. And, we are supporting them with that co-regulation. Who's supporting us, in those moments where we cannot self-regulate? And again, I've always thought we're really lucky because I've got a husband at home who finds it quite challenging to cope with the noise, the sensory sort of, busyness of our home and things like that. But we still manage to take turns. And when I absolutely cannot and I need time out, we tap in and tap out. And I think, for our parents who are single parents, caring for disabled neurodivergent children or any children, and going through that journey on their own, they don't always have somebody to tap in and tap out with them, and this is something really important for us to acknowledge as parents, that we need that support. We need, the time out every now and then.
Can I respond to that again?
Yes, absolutely.
So in the framework that I'm involved in developing, Whaipainga ki Moriora, which is Nourish to Flourish, it's a nested approach, and it talks about all those different layers of connections, amongst other things, with the movement of energy and Māori. But it's all about centering yourself. So we center the child, and that is appropriate in terms of we want the best for our young person and we want to support them. But the way in which we can support them is actually by addressing our own selves, so that we are in the right space to hold that safe space for them. Yes. Because without the adults around them doing that, then it's difficult, if not impossible, for our young people to do. So I think it's really important, and you've raised a really important point, is because when we're talking about that, if you're thinking about that as a framework and a nested approach with the circles and going out in your layers from individual self. So I talk about the kumara being in the middle, and then in the marakai, which is it's those people closest to us, and then extending out into the garden itself for this community, and then beyond out there into the greater environment as we go out through those layers. Then I lost my point now. Not helpful. But it's really that you're focused on your growth, and you are there. You may be providing shade to those next to you. You may be providing nutrients. You may be shedding water to feed the plant next to you. You may be, signaling when a caterpillar eats your leaves, that there's danger and you need to, strengthen up your resistance. But you are still focused on you and your growth, so that you are settled. Your Māori is in a place where you can nurture and uplift those around you. Because you can't make someone else do something, and you can't put something onto another, not onto our children, not onto our educators, not onto anybody. We lead the way, and we guide, and we nurture. Yeah,
I think that role modeling is so important, and I have both in my EC space, as an early intervention specialist working with our autistic tamariki. And also within my own home, what I've learned is when I go out in the community with my kids, and if they do have a meltdown, or if things aren't going the way, I expect, it is really important I role model the way I would want my child to be taken care of, so others can learn. For me, every opportunity, every interaction outside our home, I've always seen it as an educational moment for others to learn, how to engage, interact with my kids. And so I'm always sort of, nudging people along by actually showing them, what to do, how to engage, how to interact. So it's so important. Yeah. Sarah, do you want to share with us a bit about, what has that been like for you as a parent? Where and how have you managed to sort of gain support? What's it been like for you?
It's still a journey. But I think something that's been really important for our family is just, we talked earlier about recognize the child where the child is at. What does the child need? But there's an element of that for parents as well. And everybody's different and everybody's needs are different, and particularly if you've got a neurodiverse family. And there's a huge pressure to conform to certain social expectations. And you know, one of the things that helps, I don't think we're necessarily there yet as a family, but as you know, wipe away the expectations. The expectations don't matter. What actually works for us, and being sort of really holding to that. And it's not easy, for a lot of reasons. You know, there's an element of also having to recognize that we're different people and we need different things, and sometimes that's in conflict.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So how do you navigate through that so that everybody gets what they need? And you know, sometimes things don't look like a normal life, but actually that's when things are working really well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I learned was, I learned, because I've got the three boys, very different, very unique. So very early on, I learned that I could not use the same strategy. I could not use the same resource. I used to make all these laminated visuals and resources for the kids, you know. And I used to get really annoyed that I had made all of this stuff for this one child, and my second child, you know, it was totally useless for them. Couldn't use it for the third child either, because they're also different. But I've learned now that they're all different. And so I had to create space, like you say, you know, when the needs clash, or the sensory, especially the sensory needs clash.
Yeah.
I had to literally physically create different spaces in the home. And I had to make sure that they all had what they needed in their sort of separate spaces, because otherwise it was too much for them. It would be overwhelming for them. One of the things, you know, in terms of I mean, in general, this is just sort of, you know, a broad brush. What causes trauma, especially for our neurodivergent individuals, and often are disabled people as well, is, you know, that whole sensory aspect. So there's trauma coming through all those sensory experiences, which may not be appropriate, which, you know, they may not be able to manage and cope with. And sometimes you don't have the options or choices, you know, for adapting this environments in that sensory aspect. And then you've got, of course, that attachment sort of, you know, trauma coming from attachment, which is usually because of, I think there's very subtle ways in which people you interact with can either validate you or invalidate you. And I've really learned that a lot of the language I used early on was quite invalidating for my children. I've become more mindful now about the kind of language I use with them, you know, setting up those expectations like, oh, can you just do it? Oh, come on, you know, just get on with it. You know, even those, you know, the behavioral strategies that we got taught early on, like, yes, you've got this, yes, you can do it. It's like, you know, imagine having that pressure of, yes, you can do it, and knowing, no, I can't, or I don't want to even, you know, all of these things. So, you know, through the attachments that we build, you know, that trauma can sort of occur as well. And then, of course, there's the social causes in, you know, the social spaces, you know, the pressure to conform, or, you know, your authenticity is not valid, and all of that, that can also sort of cause trauma. So I think I've become more mindful now as a parent about, you know, what am I doing in these spaces? How am I making sure that I'm more mindful about the way I'm interacting, engaging, the language I'm using, and also some of that, you know, sensory space. How do I carry on creating different spaces for the kids so that their individual needs are met? Look, the one thing I want to acknowledge in this conversation is that we are three mothers sitting here coming with a lot of, I guess, privilege and support around us. And this is not always possible for all our families. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important for our, you know, wider spaces to become trauma informed, so that they allow for safe spaces for everybody, so that they are actually working proactively towards preventing trauma. Really, really important to sort of acknowledge that here. And it's always, I felt, privileged throughout my journey that I have managed to get supports, good disability supports. I've got sort of, those natural supports around us as well. There have been times where we haven't had that, and I have felt the pressure. I have then felt the pressure and realized how much more difficult it is. So I think that is something really important to acknowledge. And if you are working with our families, just be mindful of that. If you are professionals who are engaging with our children and families, be really mindful that when you are engaging with them, you don't know the backstory, you don't know how much support they have or not, and what sort of I would say what nervous system state are they in as they manage to cope and sort of often survive rather than thrive. So it's really important to be mindful of that. Both of you ladies, is there anything you want to share in terms of that you're doing, the work you're doing, anything at all that, you'd like to share with our listeners today? Vanessa, I know you do quite a bit of stuff. Have you been facilitating workshops as well? Because I know you'd spoken ages ago at something at one of the webinars. This was probably a year ago. Do you want to share a bit about anything that's happening in your space right now?
Sorry, it's cutting in and out. Who was that directed to?
Oh, Vanessa, you go ahead.
Sorry, it's cutting in and out a bit. It's dropping in about in my end. Yes, I have been involved in facilitation. So I work with the awesome Brooke Tremor with potential to performance, and we do lots of work with schools. I do lots of work with whānau and young people. A lot of my work is in a voluntary capacity, and it has to fit around obviously our family commitments. I really want to jump off that, and actually what I really want to do is be able to have people go home and say that they've taken some new learnings home and how to actually put things into practice, because we're sharing our stories, which I think is important. We're putting context in and people can make connections to it, but I really think it's valuable to be able to walk away and say, you know what, I'm going to try this at home. We naturally, I'm speaking for myself, I naturally gravitate towards things that my young person can do. And we do them together. So what we have learned in terms of connecting to our body and staying connected, not dissociating, and being able to keep our thinking brain on and stay out of a triggered state, movement is key. So Bruce Perry talks about the 7 R's, and I can't rattle them off, but I can tell you that 2 of them, one of them is rhythmic and one of them is repetitive. Yeah. And those rhythmic movements, like a sensory swing, especially one that swaddles you and gives you that deep pressure, along with that rhythmic movement, is very, very settling. It's very soothing to the nervous system. It really helps the body to stay grounded. Going out into te taio, into nature, go and stand out there on bare feet, get in the mud, climb a tree, if you're allowed, if you're at school or whatever, but go and move your body, because what it's telling our body is that it's moved, and if there was a threat, real or otherwise, our body perceives it as real, that we have been able to move, and therefore we have taken ourselves away from it. So we go into fight first. If we can't, get that right, we will flee first if we can, but if we don't feel like we can escape, we will fight. So if we can move, we've told our body that we've removed ourselves from the danger, and that helps us to calm our bodies. Sensory things, really interesting, because I acknowledge that you're talking about the overstimulation, and it's a real mix. We have a different profile for every person as to what they receive as supporting and nurturing, and what feels like they're being poked with forks, as Brooke would say, and those shift and change according to where you're at during the day, where you're at in terms of, what time of year and what pressures are on, what's happening around you, how your connections are. But like, so I've come in tonight. I was super nervous about presenting tonight, and I don't even know why. I've done so many different things, but I was really nervous, probably because so many of my awesome peeps are here. So I have brought a whole heap of my kit with me. I'm sitting in my office, but like for me, being able to put pressure on something spiky is really good. So this is a spiky bracelet. I've got my Shakti mat here. Things like this help ground you in the space. You go out to Taioa, you'll find some spiky branches. It will have exactly the same effect. You know, it's that telling your body, hey, focus on this input. Oh, yeah, I can focus on that input. I don't have something else that's more pressing. I don't have to worry about my safety. For our young people in schools, we have heartbeat bears because it has a rhythm. It has a heartbeat that goes in it, and they can literally hug it and they get that rhythm. It's discreet. It's not, you know, invasive. So there's lots of different strategies and approaches that we can use. Some of them, yes, involve things. Many of them do not. It's a matter of knowing you can do a butterfly hug. You have the deep pressure like the swing. You have a rhythm. It's not the swing, but you can have your heartbeat rhythm. And it's a matter of being able to take that away and try it. And honestly, it's about doing it with, not getting other people to do it, or, you know, it's about leading, making it fun, doing it for yourself, role modeling it whenever, no pressure on anybody else. Pick it up, make it normalized. Yeah.
So one of the other R's is rewarding. And so it actually has to be rewarding, something that's, you know, really going to work for you. It has to be respectful. I know that one. And then Bruce Perry talks about it being relevant. So, you know, contextual. What might work for me is not going to work for you, and, you know, that sort of stuff. So I think that one bit around being relevant is so important, because often people think that if, you know, this is a strategy that's a common one. Bear hugs is a common one. You know, deep pressure is a common one. And so people think, oh, you just go ahead and give deep pressure to calm somebody who is dysregulated. And it doesn't work that way. And I've heard people talk about it, and I'm going, no, you can't do that unless you know this is going to work for that child. Like, I've worked with children who do not want to be touched when they are upset. And, you know, there are children who do want to be touched and sort of, you know, soothed, comforted with that deep pressure. So it's so different for each individual. You've got to really, really know your child and sort of be mindful of that. And I like what you said, the do it with them, not, you know, ask someone else to do or to them. And that is a bit around that relational, you know, connection that you're building, and you're really getting down to their level and, you know, getting into it with them, so you can have that co-regulation. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is absolutely, absolutely fabulous. Thank you.
Can I jump in with a reflection?
Absolutely.
Yeah. The comment you just made, you started off, you know, we flee first, but if we can't flee, we fight. And then we talked a lot, you know, stuff that works for children. Actually, parents are in fight mode as well. And just listening to you, thinking about, you know, education's fundamental. We know as parents it's so important to our children's future. And when that becomes under threat, we can't flee. Because for most of us, the concept of homeschooling, the concept of te kura is completely foreign. It's not something that we think is an option. You know, it took us a journey of a year to even contemplate it. And even then, we weren't willing to go to homeschooling. We wanted the support around te kura. So if you're in that situation where you're dealing with an upset child and it's a dysregulated child and the parents are dysregulated, you know, that's actually really, really important. Is actually you're dealing with people who are in fight mode, because there's something here that's really fundamentally important to them and their family's well-being. And that's the only option they have, is to keep fighting. And then, so how does that change how you interact with them? You know?
Sarah, you know what you've said, it's really made me realize that, and as you were saying, Vanessa, I was thinking, you know, I never gave myself that option of flee, because the option of flee for me brought about a lot of guilt and shame, failing as a parent. And I remember when we were literally bullied out of that intermediate school, what I felt for a really, really long time was shame. It was literally shame. And I did not want to label it as shame, but it took me ages to acknowledge it. That was what I was feeling. And the reason why I felt that was because I had failed my child. I had failed to uphold their rights. And that is really, really hard. And, it was the first time I had failed and not fought, So it was really hard. So I get what you're saying, Sarah. It is really hard for us as parents to take the safer option of flee because, that is in a lot of ways safer, easier. And there have been so many times where I've pondered, I wish I could just let go. I wish I could, but the impact on my child. And the reason why I would think about that impact is I was very focused on, the research that shows the value of inclusion. Now, obviously, inclusion, when done well, it has those really fabulous, positive, long-term life outcomes for our children. But when inclusion is not inclusion, when it is literally, surviving in a mainstream space without the right supports, and sort of, causes trauma for our children, then that's not inclusion. And that no longer is, safe or preferable. And I think it took me a long time to understand that. So I hear you in terms of how it took you that time to arrive at that conclusion of actually Takura is a better option, or moving away from school is a better option, because that's the norm, that's what you're expected as a parent to do. So it's so important, isn't it, that we open ourselves to looking at things in different ways and working with what is really important, essential at that moment. And it changes from time to time because our nervous systems will function, differently in different situations, depending on the level of stressors we're facing. So it's really important to acknowledge that and be kind to ourselves, isn't it? We've got to be kind to ourselves as parents. So yeah. Look, thank you guys. Thank you so much for sharing today. I really do appreciate it. Is there anything that you wanted to say before we close this korero today?
Can I add something before we go?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can I share just a couple of things for de-escalation?
Yes, absolutely.
So, first of all, for those who aren't familiar with the term neuroception, it's the notion that our bodies talk to each other, that we have different mechanisms, just like with the kumara plants, they do it with chemicals and with touch and other things, and with shade and photoreceptors. We do that too, in our own way. So we can, we register each other's heart rhythms and how that relates to our breathing for a couple of meters or more away. You walk into a room and you say you feel like the tension, you can slice the tension with a knife, right? That's what we're talking about. And so it's neuroception is our capacity to read that. And it comes through electrically, it comes through with pheromones and all sorts of ways, and obviously visually through body language and sounds around us and things like that. So all of those are, some of those things are mechanisms that we can therefore use to deliver a message via neuroception back to others around us. So we can use our calm, our sense of toe, to pass that on, because our feelings are contagious. I can honestly open say I flipped out with my children a lot when they were younger, and I didn't understand what was going on, and I was at a loss for strategies, and so I would rock it. And then of course, two wrongs don't make a right, but when you don't have other strategies, what the hell are you doing? You default to whatever is left, which is not a lot, quite frankly. So we could use that neuroception. It's our superpower. And again, with this knowledge, this is deep ancestral knowledge. It's embedded already culturally and in place, and through korero, pūrākau, waita. It's there in different mechanisms from different cultural perspectives. And breath is one of the most powerful, because if we use our breath and we practice our deep breathing, we communicate to our inner self that we are safe. And through that, we get what was called a state of coherence between our lungs and our heart, and it alters our rhythm, which can be measured through heart rate variability. So HRV is a term that you sometimes hear about. And that rhythm is emanated out from us. And when it's coherent and it's in a beautiful pattern, we're actually sending out signals of safety to those around us. So they are being received subconsciously. Now, if we're talking about conscious ways of, the senses that we are used to talking about and expressing and receiving with, high-pitched sounds like, the screech of a hokioi, a giant eagle, or a low growl like a moa boom or something. Those are the sorts of things that traditionally trigger us off in terms of danger. So if we hear a high-pitched voice, when we get upset, we go high, right? Or if we get really mad, we might go low. They're the two, and that all we're doing is signaling more danger. So it's up to us, if once we've got our breathing sorted, we're in a space that's toe, then we can use our voices within a range which tells the others around us that they're safe. Slow, melodic. Think about talking to a baby, you're singing to a baby. It's those sorts of tones, it's that slow pace. It's an expression that is not neutral, but soft. It's not harsh. You're giving off all the signals that safe. We want to step back. We want to give space. We let them determine how close to be. More space and move our way in, react as accordingly. We also know if we're going too close, we'll see any re-escalation. Don't stand in their peripheral. Don't come in the peripheral of our young people, and don't stand behind them. Behind, can't see, full alert. And the peripheral, designed to catch movement purely for threat detection. So when we're talking about our kids in the classroom, it's a busy environment. They need to be in a space where they haven't got people walking behind them or standing or moving around them in those sorts of spaces. The other one is getting down to their level. So even if we're like 3 or 4 meters away, be down low, come down to their level. And when they're really escalated, just zip it.
Yes.
Don't try and talk. You can talk at them, and all that is not even going to go in, because our ears turn off, our vision either goes tunnel or disappears completely, or we're wired to turn these things off because we're now fully focused on staying alive. And I have a story of that with one of ours, because when we're at that really, really low point, and that exclusion time period, we went to go to the library, and the whole world was so overwhelming that on even going out with friends, we had it on a number of occasions, he just he passed out, slid down the door, and would vomit. And now that's the body actually in a state of, I am under death threat. And all it was going to town. Or got, because he was so hypervigilant and the system was so wide. So the key, this is the last point I'm going to make, and then I'll be quiet, sorry, is that we have to complete the cycle of emotions. We have to reconnect. We disconnect, out of those big feels, we're unsettled. When we start with settled, we're triggered, go into an unsettled state, whether that's distressed outwardly, whether it's internally. It's that process of reconnecting and coming back to a settled state. That's the healing cycle. It's when we don't complete that, and we don't reconnect, and we re-trigger back round, or we don't stay long enough in that settled period to start to slowly stretch it out, then we are traumatizing and re-traumatizing. If we continue that cycle of reconnection over and over again, we stretch out how long in a settled period, we decrease the triggering, we decrease the extent of distress. Yeah.
That's beautifully put. I haven't heard the whole repair cycle put in so well. That is absolutely beautifully put in. Vanessa, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Really, really appreciate it. All right. Sarah, did you want to say anything before we close? You all good? Look, I just want to say thank you both so much. Really do appreciate it. As I've said, this is close to your heart. This is your lived experience. So we are privileged for your generosity, coming here tonight and sharing that with us, so everybody can learn and grow in terms of their understanding how to support our tamariki, and how to ensure their safety their inclusion, their sense of belonging, so that they can learn and thrive and, inhabit spaces alongside everybody else. So thank you so much. I will close us off with a karakia, and then we can take a few questions if anybody has any questions, okay? So, karakia whakamutunga. Kia whakairia te tapu kia wātea ai te ara. Kia turuki whakataha ai. Kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, taikie. So restrictions are moved, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Thank you, everybody. I'm just gonna quickly pause recording, and then we can have a chat if anybody